They say the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were built for love. They also say they were built for politics. And some say they were never built at all. Somewhere between the dry bricks of Mesopotamia and the damp pages of Greek historians, a story began. A king, a queen from a greener land, and an impossible garden suspended above the desert. Trees where there should have been none. Water flowing where rivers feared to go. But history is stubborn. We have no blueprints. No ruins. No receipts. Just descriptions, second-hand, translated, and written by men who had never been within 100 miles of Babylon. And yet, people believe. Maybe it's because the desert needs its miracles. Or because every empire, no matter how dusty, craves one soft, green corner where it can pretend to be kind. This is not just a story about a wonder of the ancient world. It's about irrigation, stubborn kings, exhausted workers, and the way myths grow faster than any tree. So, welcome to Babylon, or what's left of it. A city of sunburned stones, ambitious architects, and a garden that may have existed only in the minds of the people who missed the rain. Take a deep breath. Imagine the scent of flowers in a place that forgot what flowers were. We begin. Babylon was not green. It was a city of sun-baked bricks, straight roads, and walls so tall they blocked the horizon. Travelers described its gates, the famous blue-glazed Ishtar Gate, but no one wrote poems about the air. Because the air was mostly dust. And yet, this was the capital of an empire. A place where kings dreamed bigger than the desert allowed. They had rivers to command, armies to feed, and gods to impress. In Babylon, ambition was a building material. We imagine the Hanging Gardens standing here, floating above the heat like an oasis that had taken a wrong turn. But before there were gardens, there was mud. The Euphrates River gave Babylon its life, and its problems. It flooded when it shouldn't, and dried up when it was needed most. Managing water was not romance. It was mathematics, labor, and endless shouting between engineers. For every myth about the Hanging Gardens, there was a man with a bucket. Yet, the stories begin not with mud, but with a king, Nebuchadnezzar II. He ruled in the 6th century BCE, built walls that terrified his enemies, and reportedly loved a queen from the greener lands of Media. One version says he built the gardens for her, so she wouldn't miss the mountains of her homeland. It's a charming story. But charming stories rarely match budgets. No tablets from Babylon mention the gardens. Not a single invoice for palm tree hoist or exotic flower imports. Historians find this suspicious. After all, Babylonian scribes loved writing things down. They kept records of beer rations for workers, beer, down to the last drop, but not one note about a 7-tiered botanical marvel. The Greeks, however, loved the idea. Centuries later, they wrote of terraces stacked like steps to heaven, watered by hidden machinery, and filled with trees so heavy they required stone vaults to hold them. A paradise of shade in a city of glare. Was it propaganda? A traveler's exaggeration? Or simply what happens when you describe Mesopotamia to someone who has never left the Aegean Sea? Maybe it didn't matter. Because once a story like this enters the world, it sticks. A garden in Babylon became not just a possibility, but a symbol, proof that kings could defy nature. That you could hang greenery in the sky and call it civilization. And if it was only a myth? Well, myths have better architects than empires. Babylon itself left ruins, crumbling bricks, cracked tablets, and foundations that go nowhere. But the Hanging Gardens? They remain oddly intact, not in the ground, but in memory. And so, as the desert wind sweeps through the empty plains where Babylon once stood, one can almost hear it, the quiet rustle of imaginary leaves, suspended forever above a city that could never quite decide if it wanted to be real or legendary. Babylon was not built in a day. It was baked, hammered, and tarred into existence, brick by brick, under a sun that never forgave anyone. Before there could be any hanging gardens, there was only ground, wet, unstable ground that had to be bullied into obedience. The Babylonians did not have quarries full of stone. They had mud. They shaped it into bricks, stamped them with the king's name, and left them to dry until they were as hard as the desert itself. Millions of bricks, each one a declaration of power and paperwork combined. Walk through Babylon and you would be surrounded not by nature, but by bureaucracy turned into architecture. The smell of the city was unforgettable, hot bitumen. Tar pits bubbled like black cauldrons, tended by men who worked half-naked, their bodies glistening with sweat and streaked with dark stains that never washed out. Bitumen was not glamorous, but it was Babylon's glue, slathered between bricks, poured into cracks, and brushed onto canal walls until the whole city reeked of empire. And then there was the river. The Euphrates was Babylon's lifeblood, but it was also an uncooperative beast. It brought water, silt, and trade, but it also flooded when it felt like it. Controlling it required canals, levees, and pumps that made the city less of a settlement and more of a machine. The engineers, sharp-eyed men with clay tablets in their hands, spent their days arguing over gradients and water pressure while shouting at workers to move faster. If the hanging gardens existed, they would not have begun as a royal dream but as an engineering problem. Water does not climb, not on its own. To lift it, Babylonians used chain pumps, wooden wheels, long chains, and buckets that clattered endlessly as oxen trudged in circles. It was not elegant. It was noisy, repetitive, and smelled faintly of wet rope and animal sweat. Yet without it, there could be no garden, only dust. And the workers, thousands of them, did not speak of wonders. They spoke of rations. Beer was their currency, their fuel, and their only consolation in a city that never cooled down. The tablets that survive today do not describe beauty. They describe beer, who got how much, and when. We know precisely how many liters a bricklayer received, but not whether he ever looked up at the terraces he was helping build. In the evenings, the camps came alive. Workers huddled around fires, their hands raw from hauling bricks and mixing mortar. Some traded gossip, others just stared into the flames, silent, their faces cracked from sun and exhaustion. The city walls loomed behind them, massive and unfeeling, while the unfinished palace of Nebuchadnezzar rose like a challenge to the sky. And somewhere, this is easy to imagine, a single labor, nameless to history, paused in his work and looked at the first terrace of the supposed gardens. It was only bare stone and scaffolding then, but maybe, just for a moment, he wondered if one day there would be shade there. Not for kings. For him. He would never see it finished. Most workers didn't. They came and went, swallowed by the desert or sent to other projects, leaving their sweat in the bricks. But that is how Babylon worked. Nothing was built for those who built it. And so, while scribes scratched numbers onto clay tablets, while oxen plodded in endless circles, while men cursed the heat and the smell of tar, something extraordinary was slowly, painfully, rising out of the dust. Not a garden yet. Not paradise. But the skeleton of an idea. If Babylon was a machine, then Nebuchadnezzar was the man cranking its gears. His name still lingers on thousands of bricks, stamped like a royal signature across the city. He was a builder first, a conqueror second, and, if legend is to be believed, a husband who wanted to impress his wife with the most extravagant gesture in Mesopotamian history. Herodotus never wrote about the gardens, and some scholars argue they never existed at all. But stories insist that Nebuchadnezzar built them for Amytes, his Median queen, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. Babylon, for all its wealth, was a city of dust and sun, its only shade cast by walls taller than most trees. If the tale is true, the gardens were not an act of statecraft but of homesickness. Imagine a king who could order armies to march, temples to rise, and rivers to bend, pausing one day to ask, "Can we build her a mountain?" And the answer, apparently, was yes, though yes in Babylon often meant years of labor and more bricks than anyone could count. The engineers sketched plans into wet clay, terraces stacked one atop another like the steps of a man-made hill. Each layer would need to be strong enough to hold soil, water, and trees without collapsing. Beneath it, vaults of stone and brick would bear the weight, sealed tight with bitumen. To the ordinary laborer, it probably looked less like a garden and more like a fortress. But the king's vision did not stop at structure. Water, the rarest treasure of all, would be hauled up from the Euphrates, feeding pools and streams that would spill over the terraces. Palm trees, cypress, figs, and vines would grow in a city that had never known such green. It would be shade in a land of heat, a river in the sky. The workers didn't dream in such grand terms. They saw only the orders carved into tablets: more bricks, more bitumen, more oxen. Nebuchadnezzar's vision trickled down the chain of command like everything else in Babylon, translated into logistics, overseers, and ration schedules. Still, it's hard not to wonder if some of them understood. Perhaps a stonemason paused in his work and looked up at the half-built terraces, imagining the trees that would one day cover the bare beams. Maybe a water carrier, knee-deep in mud, whispered to another, "They say it's for the queen." And if the story is true, perhaps Amytes herself walked the construction site one evening, her robes trailing through the dust, watching the foundations of her future garden rise from the desert. Did she smile? Did she pity the men who toiled to satisfy her homesick heart? Or did she simply nod and return to the palace, leaving the city to sweat and grind out her dream? History does not answer these questions. It only gives us the bricks. And so the garden grew, or at least the skeleton of it did. Terraces climbed upward, one after another, while oxen turned the endless water-lifting machines and scribes tracked every measure of tar and every delivery of timber. This was Babylon at its most Babylonian, turning longing into architecture and love into mathematics. If the hanging gardens truly existed, they were built not by romance, but by ledgers, sunburn, and the sheer stubbornness of a king who believed nothing was impossible, not even a mountain in the desert. If Babylon's walls were its armor, then its waterworks were its beating heart. Nothing in the desert grew by accident. Every palm, every fig tree, every patch of grass was a small rebellion against the sun. And if the hanging gardens truly existed, they were less a miracle and more a system, loud, heavy, and relentlessly practical. The Euphrates flowed broad and brown, slow in its curves but full of power. Along its banks, the Babylonians built platforms lined with wooden wheels and chain pumps, each creaking under the weight of buckets hauling water skyward. The air smelled of mud, rope, and livestock. Oxen trudged in endless circles, their hooves beating the earth like a drum. Above them, overseers barked commands while scribes tallied every drop of water lifted, their reed styluses scratching against clay. The gardens, if they could be called that yet, were still bare terraces of stone and timber. But water was already being forced upward. Workers slopped buckets of it across fresh-laid earth, soaking the soil until it clung to their feet. They built drainage channels from baked brick, narrow and clever, so that no drop would be wasted. Babylon could not afford waste. Not here, not ever. To the people in the streets, the construction was both a marvel and a nuisance. Water that might have cooled the city's dusty courtyards instead vanished into the king's new project. Rumors spread through the taverns and beer halls. This was not a garden, they said. This was madness disguised as architecture. Others whispered of the queen, homesick and pale, whose longing for green hills had turned Babylon upside down. Still, the machinery never stopped. The pumps clattered day and night. Masons hammered stone vaults tight with bitumen, sealing every crack so water would not seep through the walls. Even the smell of tar became part of Babylon's air, clinging to every street corner until no one noticed it anymore. Then came the first plants. They arrived in reed baskets, hauled in from distant lands, palm shoots, cypress saplings, and cuttings of flowering shrubs wrapped in damp cloth. Each one was more valuable than a sack of copper. Workers carried them up the scaffolding like offerings, their roots bundled as carefully as a newborn child. The terraces came alive slowly, almost shyly. First a patch of soil. Then a single tree. Then a trickle of water spilling down from a higher level, darkening the earth. And suddenly, against the beige and brick of Babylon, there was green, small, but undeniable. The workers stared at it sometimes, hands on their knees, sweat running into their eyes. They had built walls, gates, and ziggurats before, but never this. Never something that looked like it was trying to breathe. And above them, Nebuchadnezzar watched. His court scribes wrote of progress, of brick counts and water quotas, but not of what it meant. No one wrote down what the king thought as he stood on those half-finished terraces and looked out at a city that had been nothing but dust and stone, and now held a spark of another world. Somewhere below, an ox groaned. A bucket clattered. The pumps kept turning. And the machinery of green did not stop. By the time the first tree unfurled its leaves above the terraces, Babylon had never seen anything like it. For a city of sun-bleached walls and baked clay streets, a patch of green was a small miracle. The workers who had broken their backs dragging soil and hauling bricks stopped just to stare. It wasn't much, a young date palm, its trunk no thicker than a man's arm, but it cast a shadow, and in Babylon, that was power. Shade in the desert was not simply comfort. Shade was survival. Merchants paused on their way past the construction site to gape at it, wiping sweat from their brows. Some swore that the queen herself, Amytes, came to see it one evening, her fine robes trailing in the dust as she stood beneath that single tree and closed her eyes. Perhaps she smelled the faint green scent of its leaves and remembered the hills of her homeland. Or perhaps she only saw the beginning of what her husband had promised her, a mountain of paradise. The planting began in earnest after that. Palm by palm, cypress by cypress, the terraces slowly softened under green. Water flowed through brick-lined channels, trickling from terrace to terrace like veins through a living body. The ox-driven pumps groaned day and night, and still the plants drank faster than the machines could lift. It didn't matter. Babylon was relentless. With each new tree came new labor. Men carried baskets of soil from the banks of the Euphrates. Others dug pits for roots, their hands raw and blistered. Tar workers sealed every crack in the terraces to keep the precious water from vanishing into the sun-baked stone. Scribes stood above it all, tallying every delivery, every worker, every drop. The gardens were not just a dream, they were a ledger carved in sweat and clay. Yet, for all the mathematics of it, there was something else growing there, something not in any of the king's records. At night, when the torches burned low and most of Babylon slept, some of the workers crept back into the gardens. They sat under the young palms, their backs pressed against the cool bricks. They shared stolen figs, traded gossip, and laughed in whispers as the moonlight spilled over the unfinished terraces. For a few hours, it was no longer a construction site. It was a place where the desert air smelled of earth and green things, a place where men who had nothing could close their eyes and imagine that they, too, were kings. Nebuchadnezzar never saw those moments. Or perhaps he did, and he allowed them. The king was a man of ambition, but even ambition needs proof. And what better proof than the sight of his workers finding shelter in his impossible garden, as if the desert itself had been conquered? By the time the second tree sprouted, then the third, and then 100 more, the terraces became a world apart from the city below. The walls that once baked in the sun were now draped in green. Birds came, their wings flashing in the morning light. The workers paused less often, but their steps were lighter. Somewhere in the palace, Amytes may have smiled. Babylon was still dust and brick, but from the king's terraces, she could look down upon a mountain of shade, a mountain that defied the desert, and perhaps, for a moment, she believed it was enough. The hanging gardens no longer looked like scaffolding and bare stone. They had begun to breathe. Water ran down the terraces in narrow streams, glinting under the desert sun like molten glass. From a distance, it was as if a piece of the Euphrates itself had been lifted into the sky and carved into steps of green. The machinery never stopped. At dawn, the oxen plodded in slow, weary circles, dragging the chain pumps with their heavy shoulders. Buckets creaked and splashed as they rose, spilling their contents into carved cisterns that fed the gardens. Overseers shouted, scribes recorded, and masons patched every leak with tar and brick. Babylon was a city built on relentless motion, and nowhere was it louder than here. Yet for all its noise, the gardens carried a kind of stillness. On the upper terraces, where water pooled in shallow basins and reeds grew tall enough to brush the ankles of passing workers, there was a cool hush that did not belong to the desert. The smell of damp soil hung in the air, sharp and alien in a city of dust and sun-baked clay. Nebuchadnezzar often came at sunrise. The king would stand on the highest terrace, his robes trailing in the breeze, and watch the water glimmer as it slid down the channels. His dream was not yet complete. Many terraces still lacked their crowns of green, but already he could see it, a mountain of rivers, climbing into the heavens. Below, the workers spoke of the gardens with quiet pride. They had carried soil until their backs bent, hauled bricks until their hands bled, and now they watched as fish darted through shallow pools built high above the ground. Some swore that the sound of running water followed them home, a ghostly echo in their ears even as they lay in their dry, windowless rooms. But not everyone was pleased. In the smoky taverns near the ziggurat, the merchants grumbled. Water that might have fed the city's canals now vanished into the king's terraces. Bread was rising in price, they said. Barley was scarce. And yet the gardens drank endlessly, like a living god that demanded offerings. Still, no one dared to stop it. To defy the gardens was to defy Nebuchadnezzar himself, and in Babylon, kings were not questioned. The chain pumps turned, the oxen groaned, and the water rose. Then one morning, a cloud appeared. Not in the sky, but in the air above the terraces, a faint mist, cool and damp. It clung to the leaves of the palms and the long grass, a whisper of rain where rain did not belong. Some workers swore it was an omen. The heavens had come down to meet Babylon. And in that moment, even the grumbling merchants fell silent. Because if shade was power, and green was wealth, then rivers in the sky were nothing less than magic. The day Amytes first ascended the gardens, Babylon held its breath. Word spread through the streets. The queen was going to see what her husband had built for her, this mountain of stone and water rising from the heart of the desert. Merchants abandoned their stalls, and children climbed onto rooftops for a glimpse of her procession. Amytes rode in a chariot of gilded wood, shaded by a canopy of woven linen. Behind her, servants followed with baskets of figs and dates, while soldiers cleared the way. When she reached the base of the terraces, the air shifted. Here, in the shadow of the hanging gardens, the desert heat weakened, replaced by a cool dampness that smelled of earth and green leaves. The queen stepped down from her chariot and placed a hand on the first stone stair. Slowly, she climbed. The workers lined the edges of the terraces, their rough hands pressed to their chests in respect. They had seen these gardens grow from bare stone and dripping tar. Now they watched as the woman for whom it was built took her first steps into its shade. At the second terrace, water gurgled down channels lined with reeds. Amytes paused, her fingers brushing over the leaves of a young pomegranate tree. She smiled, small, quiet, but unmistakable. By the third terrace, vines coiled around wooden trellises. Birds nested in their branches, chirping as if they had forgotten the desert below. The workers whispered to each other. Some said they had never seen the queen smile before. Others swore that in that moment, even the king's stern face softened as he followed a few paces behind her. When Amytes reached the highest terrace, she stopped. Before her lay a view no one else in Babylon had ever known. A sea of green spilling down the terraces, water glinting like a river broken into steps, and beyond it, the endless desert that no longer seemed so empty. For a moment, she could almost imagine she was home again, in the mountain valleys of Media, where the air was cool and the earth never cracked from thirst. Nebuchadnezzar stood beside her. He did not speak. He only looked at her, and she at him. In that silence, something passed between them, not the command of a king or the duty of a queen, but something older and simpler, a gift given and a gift received. The workers cheered then, a rough, joyous sound that rose from every level of the gardens. The sound rolled through Babylon like thunder. And for once, even the merchants who had cursed the project stood at the base of the terraces and joined in. That night, torches burned along the terraces. The gardens glowed in the dark like a mountain of stars brought down to earth. And in the cool shade of that impossible green, Babylon, dusty, hungry, and loud, felt, for a moment, like paradise. The gardens no longer belonged to the workers, or even to the king. They had become a creature of their own, a living thing with roots of stone and veins of water, forever hungry. The chain pumps groaned day and night. Oxen walked in endless circles, their hooves grinding against the dirt until it turned to dust. Buckets clattered, spilling water into cisterns that fed the terraces above. No matter how much they poured in, the gardens drank it all. Scribes began recording the numbers. Every day, more water was taken from the canals. Every day, more grain barges had to wait as workers diverted the flow toward the gardens. Some complained that the city's canals ran low, that farmers downstream cursed Babylon's thirst. But Nebuchadnezzar only waved his hand. "Let them curse," he said. "The gardens are Babylon's crown." At night, the workers whispered that the gardens were alive. They said the trees grew faster than they should, their roots splitting stone, their leaves spreading as if they reached for the sun even after dark. One man swore he saw a fig tree bloom twice in a single season. Another said he heard the sound of rushing water even when the pumps were still, as if the terraces themselves sighed in their sleep. And yet, there was beauty. By the 4th month, the terraces overflowed with green. Cypress and cedar stood tall beside palms. Vines draped down the walls like veils. Flowers bloomed in colors Babylon had no words for. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth, and for the first time, shade lay across the city like a blessing. But beauty had its price. The merchants grumbled louder now. Bread cost twice what it had before. Farmers fought over water in the fields. And in the taverns near the ziggurat, a new joke spread. If the gardens keep growing, soon Babylon will eat sand for supper. Still, no one dared to stop it. Because for every curse muttered in the dark, there was also a glance upward at the terraces, at that mountain of impossible green, and a silence that followed. It was hard to stay angry in the shadow of paradise. One night, Amytes walked the highest terrace alone. The moonlight turned the pool silver and the leaves pale as bone. She touched the trunk of a cedar and closed her eyes. For a moment, she imagined the sound of rain in her homeland. She thought of the king, of his stubborn hands shaping stone and dream alike. And though she said nothing, her smile returned, small, private, but real. Down below, the oxen groaned on. The pumps turned. And the gardens drank. By the 9th month, the gardens no longer felt like a triumph. They felt like a war. The engineers met in shadowed halls beneath the ziggurat, maps and tablets spread across wooden tables. Their hands were stained with clay, tar, and sleeplessness. Every day, more cracks appeared in the terraces. The roots of cypress and fig trees gnawed at the stone, prying apart the joints sealed with bitumen. Water seeped into places it was never meant to reach, pooling in the cracks and weakening the walls. One night, Nabuatir, the chief engineer, stood before Nebuchadnezzar. His voice was low, but firm. "My king, we built the gardens strong, but stone is not the mountain. It will move. It will break." Nebuchadnezzar stared at him for a long time. "Then fix it," he said. So they fixed it. They hauled up more stone from the quarries, thick blocks dragged through the city by oxen whose ribs showed from hunger. They burned tar in great pits until the air smelled of smoke and pitch. They reinforced every terrace, sealing cracks, binding roots with woven reeds and plaster. But the gardens grew heavier. The pumps groaned louder. Water ran faster through the channels, grinding them smooth. Some engineers whispered that they were only feeding a monster, an impossible green beast devouring Babylon brick by brick. Still, no one dared stop. One evening, as the sun bled red over the walls, Nabuatir stood on the highest terrace. Below him, the city sprawled, a sea of rooftops and winding streets. The gardens rose above it all, their trees catching the last light like green fire. He should have been proud. Instead, he felt a weight in his chest heavier than the stone beneath his feet. "Will it hold?" one of his younger men asked. "For a season," Nabuatir said. "Then, quieter, perhaps two." And yet, that very night, torches burned bright again along the terraces. Musicians played at the base of the gardens. The king and queen dined beneath palm trees that had never known the desert. Amytes laughed, her voice carrying softly on the wind, and for a moment, all the city forgot the cracks, the hunger, and the weary hands that held paradise together. But Nabuatir did not forget. He watched the moon rise over the gardens, pale and silent, and wondered how long men could keep the earth itself from falling. By the 10th month, the Euphrates ran thinner than the priests liked. The river had always been Babylon's lifeline, feeding its canals, filling its cisterns, and turning its mills. Now, more than half its strength was swallowed by the chain pumps of the hanging gardens. The farmers complained first, their fields dry and cracked. Then the merchants, their barges stuck in sluggish channels, shouted in the market squares. But the king did not answer them. Nebuchadnezzar only stared at his creation, his mountain of green, and said, "The river serves Babylon. And the gardens are Babylon." Yet, in the taverns near the riverbanks, the whispers began. Men cursed the engineers who fed the pumps day and night. Some called the gardens the king's thirst, as though it were not stone and soil at all, but a living mouth that drank and drank without end. Nabuatir heard these whispers, but he had no answers. He only had numbers scratched into clay, water lost from the canals, grain yields halved, barges running empty. And still, the gardens demanded more. In the evenings, as the sun dipped low and painted the terraces gold, the oxen plodded in weary circles, their flanks streaked with sweat. Slaves carried buckets on their shoulders, filling cistern after cistern, until their legs shook and their hands blistered raw. Even then, the channels ran dry by dawn. One night, Nabuatir stood by the river, listening to it groan against its banks. An old boatman spat into the water and said, "Once, this river belonged to us. Now it belongs to the queen's trees." And still, no one dared stop. The king held another banquet on the upper terraces, inviting priests, merchants, and foreign envoys. There was music and wine and laughter that spilled down the walls of the gardens like water itself. Queen Amytes walked among the guests in silken robes, her eyes bright, her smile soft. From the highest terrace, the city looked small, quiet, and obedient. But Nabuatir, standing in the shadows near the pumps, saw something else. He saw the cracks deepening. He saw roots curling like serpents around the stones. He saw water running faster, always faster, as if the gardens knew that the city below was already theirs. And for the first time, he wondered if Babylon could drown without ever sinking. The first crack was no wider than a finger. It appeared on the third terrace, running along the mortar between two stones. Nabatea touched it with the tips of his fingers, feeling the dampness seeping through. The roots had found a way in. By the next week, there were 5 cracks. Water bled from them, dripping into the chambers below, darkening the ceilings like veins beneath skin. Workers scrambled with buckets of tar and clay, but the water always returned. It laughed at their repairs. In the halls beneath the gardens, the engineers argued. Some wanted to tear down entire sections and rebuild. Others warned that even removing a single block could bring down the weight above. Nabatea listened in silence, his face drawn tight. Then Nebuchadnezzar came. The king stood before the cracks, his robe heavy with gold thread. He ran his hand along the wet stone, then turned to Nabatea. "How long?" he asked. "A season," Nabatea said. His voice was dry as dust. "Perhaps 2, if the river holds." The king said nothing. He only looked at the terraces rising above him, the trees swaying in the wind like they were mocking him. That night, the workers burned tar through the dark hours. Slaves hammered wedges of stone into place while the engineers shouted orders until their throats cracked. The smell of smoke and bitumen hung over the gardens like a storm cloud. But even as the cracks spread, the beauty of the gardens deepened. The trees grew thicker, their branches weaving into green canopies that shaded the terraces below. Flowers draped the walls, and the scent of jasmine and myrrh mingled with the stench of tar and sweat. In the palace, Amytes still walked the terraces barefoot, her silken robes trailing behind her. She placed her hand on the walls and whispered something no one could hear. Some said she prayed. Others swore she was speaking to the gardens themselves. And below, Nabatea stood in the waterlogged chambers, staring at the cracks and the black roots writhing inside them. He thought of the oxen circling without rest, of the river thinning, of the city bending under its king's dream. He wondered if they had built paradise, or a tomb. By the 12th month, the gardens groaned like an old ship. Every terrace carried the burden of earth, roots, and stone, stacked higher than any builder in Babylon had dared before. The chain pumps clattered day and night, dragging water up from the Euphrates as if trying to feed a living thing that could never be full. Nabatea no longer dreamed of sleep. He lived in the tunnels beneath the gardens, his hands black with tar, his ears filled with the sound of dripping water. When he closed his eyes, he saw cracks running like veins through stone, spreading faster than his men could mend them. Above, however, the world was green. Queen Amytes strolled through the terraces at dawn, her feet brushing against dew-soaked grass. The flowers bloomed wild and fragrant, vines crept over archways like emerald ribbons. To her, it was paradise. To Nabatea, it was weight, a crushing, endless weight pressing down on the city. Merchants cursed the gardens in the markets. Farmers spat at the engineers when they passed, blaming them for the dry canals. Priests muttered that the gods would punish the king's arrogance. Yet the banquets never stopped. The music never ceased. The gardens had become a monument not only to beauty but to defiance. One night, Nebuchadnezzar descended into the tunnels. He found Nabatea sitting by a leaking wall, staring at it as if it might answer him. "My king," Nabatea said, his voice hoarse, "stone is not meant to carry the sky." Nebuchadnezzar knelt beside him. His eyes burned with something fierce and unshakable. "Then teach the stone to hold it," he said. The next morning, new orders came. More stone. More tar. More oxen for the pumps. The city groaned as laborers were pulled from their homes to feed the garden's hunger. Yet at sunset, from the highest terrace, it was hard not to believe. Babylon stretched to the horizon, gilded in the red light of evening. The river shimmered. The gardens swayed in the breeze, their leaves whispering as if mocking every doubt. And in that moment, Nabuetir understood why no one could stop it. The hanging gardens were no longer a wonder. They were a curse that no one wanted to break. The river had been patient. 4 years, the Euphrates had surrendered its strength to the pumps, feeding the gardens drop by drop. But now, it turned against Babylon. In the summer of the 13th year, the river ran dangerously low. Barges lay stranded in muddy shallows, their cargo rotting in the sun. The canals that once brought life to the fields were no more than dry trenches where children played in the dust. Farmers knelt in the cracked soil, holding withered stalks in their hands like offerings to forgotten gods. Yet the gardens still drank. Oxen plodded in endless circles, their ribs showing. Slaves staggered under buckets. The pumps clattered like bones in a tomb. Nabuetir stood by the river one dawn, watching the pale current crawl sluggishly past the city walls. His reflection stared back at him, gaunt and hollow-eyed. "It is not the river that fails," he muttered to himself. "It is us." But the king would not listen. That evening, Nebuchadnezzar stood on the highest terrace, the city stretched out beneath him like a conquered prize. "The gardens are Babylon," he proclaimed to his court. "If the river dies, we will chain the sky itself to water them." His words rolled like thunder, and no one dared answer. In the streets, famine crept closer. Bread prices soared. Fights broke out at the canals. Priests gathered in the temples, chanting prayers to Ea, god of the waters, while the sound of the pumps echoed in the distance, louder than any hymn. Then, one morning, Nabuetir saw it, water seeping through the walls of the gardens, not in cracks but in torrents. The terraces bled like wounded beasts. Workers waded knee-deep through mud that had no place in the sky. And in that dripping, choking darkness, he understood. The gardens were no longer only drinking the river, they were spitting it back, flooding their own bones from the inside. That night, the old boatman from the river docks came to Nabuetir. He said nothing, only pressed a small, cracked jar of river clay into his hands. "For when it breaks," the man rasped. Nabuetir held the jar tightly, as if it could keep him from drowning in the sound of the pumps. Because now, he realized, Babylon was sinking. And it wasn't the river that would swallow it. It was the gardens. The sound came first. A low, groaning hum that rolled through the tunnels beneath the gardens like the voice of something ancient waking from its sleep. Nabuetir was there when the first wall buckled. He felt it through his feet before he saw it, stone trembling, mortar splitting, water bursting through in a cold, relentless surge. Workers screamed and dropped their tools. Torches fell into the rising flood, hissing out one by one until only darkness remained. Nabuetir shouted for them to run, his voice drowned by the roar of water and grinding stone. Above, the terraces still glittered in the morning sun. Queen Ametes walked among the flowers, her silken robes brushing against damp vines. She smiled faintly, as if the gardens whispered only to her, hiding their collapse from the world below. But in the tunnels, Nabuetir waded waist-deep through rushing water, clutching the jar of river clay the old boatman had given him. He pressed it against a crack as wide as his hand, as if the tiny gift could hold back the weight of paradise. It didn't. The stone split with a sound like thunder. Water gushed out in a single violent torrent, knocking men from their feet. Somewhere above, a terrace shuddered, and a tree toppled, its roots tearing through brick and soil like claws. When word reached Nebuchadnezzar, he did not rage. He did not weep. He simply stood on the highest terrace and stared at the city, his jaw clenched. To him, Babylon was not drowning, it was defying the river, even as it sank beneath its own miracle. By nightfall, the lower tunnels were lost. Workers abandoned their posts. Priests called it a curse. Merchants swore the gardens would fall within the month. Yet still, the king ordered more stone, more tar, more oxen. And Nabutir, soaked and shivering in the dark, realized he no longer knew if he was repairing the gardens or entombing them. The walls groaned again, deep and mournful. It was almost like crying. At dawn, Babylon held its breath. The hanging gardens loomed in the pale light, their terraces sagging under the weight of water and stone. From a distance, they still seemed glorious, green banners of vines cascading over brick, flowers spilling like rivers of color. But up close, the illusion cracked. The walls bled. The pumps clattered with a hollow rhythm, like a dying heart. Nabutir stood in the lower tunnels, soaked to the bone, his hands raw and trembling. The jar of river clay was gone, lost to the floods that swallowed the lowest chambers. Around him, the men worked in silence, no longer repairing, only delaying. Above, Queen Amytes wandered through her paradise one final time. Her bare feet brushed against grass that would not last another season. She paused to pluck a single blossom, white, perfect, and trembling in the breeze. She pressed it to her lips and closed her eyes. And far above her, Nebuchadnezzar watched the sun climb over the horizon. He looked not at the cracks, nor the mud-stained terraces, but at the vision he had made real. Babylon's people whispered that he had defied the gods. He believed he had simply outbuilt them. But by midday, the first terrace fell. The sound was not thunder, it was worse. A grinding, tearing howl as roots ripped free and stones tumbled like dice cast by an unseen hand. Dust rose in choking clouds. The river swallowed the rubble without hesitation. Still, the gardens did not die all at once. Even in ruin, they clung to life. Water spilled down their broken walls like silver threads. Palm trees leaned sideways but did not fall. Flowers bloomed defiantly in shattered soil. It was as if the earth itself refused to admit defeat. Nabutir climbed to the upper terrace, his lungs burning. He found Amytes there, standing barefoot amid the wreckage, the single white blossom still in her hand. She turned to him and smiled, tired, wistful, unafraid. "Even if it falls," she said softly, "it was beautiful, wasn't it?" He had no answer. Behind them, Nebuchadnezzar raised his hand. Not to command, not to order more stone, but simply to hold the sun in his palm for one impossible moment. And in that silence, the hanging gardens stood as they were meant to be, a dream defiant against time. By nightfall, half the terraces were gone. By the next dawn, they were nothing but ruin. But for one day, one fleeting day, Babylon had seen paradise. And sometimes, Nabutir thought, that was enough.